So, this happened a few years ago, back when I was a total mess, living alone in this old, creaky house that my grandfather left me. I was maybe 25, fresh out of a soul-sucking marketing job I hated, and just trying to figure things out. My life was basically a loop. Wake up, drink way too much coffee, try to write a little, fail miserably, and then spend the rest of the night binging on whatever was on Netflix. I wasn't exactly a social butterfly. My closest friends were the old books gathering dust on the shelves and the barista at the coffee shop down the street who always knew my order. The house itself was a character, you know? It had this strange, heavy silence that felt more like a presence than an absence of noise, and the floorboards would groan and complain with every step, like the house itself was sighing. I just saw it as part of the charm, something to be endured, never realizing that its secrets were far more intimate and terrifying than I could have ever imagined. That IT started with a text message from a number I didn't recognize. The screen lit up with a simple, almost banal message: "You're wearing a blue shirt today." I remember looking down at my faded old t-shirt and just laughing. It had to be a wrong number, or maybe one of my friends playing a dumb prank. I texted back, "Who is this?" but got no reply. A few hours later, another message popped up. I was sitting at my desk, trying to finish a chapter of a novel I was working on, and had just made myself a fresh pot of coffee. The message read, "The coffee you just made looks good." I froze. I hadn't posted anything online. My windows were covered. There was no way anyone could have known. A wave of unease washed over me, but I brushed it off, convincing myself it was a weird coincidence, probably a joke from someone I hadn't seen in years. That was my mistake, thinking I could rationalize it away. Then the messages got weirder, and the fear started to curdle in my stomach. That night, after a few hours of reading, I turned in. Sleep has always been a battle for me, a tug-of-war between my mind and my body. I remember tossing and turning, my mind racing through a million little worries. I must have switched positions 3 or 4 times before I finally drifted off into a restless sleep, full of half-formed thoughts and anxieties. The next morning, I woke up with my phone face down on the nightstand. When I picked it up, there was a new message waiting. "You turned over 3 times before finally falling asleep." My blood ran cold. How could anyone know that? It was a detail so personal, so mundane, that it sent a shiver down my spine. I was alone in the house. There were no windows facing my bedroom from any other building. The thought that someone, or something, was watching me, counting my every move, was a suffocating weight on my chest. The messages continued, each one more specific and unsettling than the last. I started to check every window, every corner of the house, convinced someone had somehow hidden a camera. One night, I had this terrible nightmare, the kind that leaves you breathless and disoriented. It was about my father, a man I hadn't spoken to in years after a bitter fight. In the dream, he was standing at the end of a long, dark hallway, his face shrouded in shadow, and he just kept repeating my name over and over in a low, guttural whisper. I woke up with a gasp, my heart pounding against my ribs like a frantic bird. I grabbed my phone, and there it was, a new text message. "Your nightmare was about your father, wasn't it?" The words were like a physical blow. The terror was overwhelming, a raw, primal fear that gripped me and wouldn't let go. This wasn't a prank anymore. This was something else entirely. Something dark and impossibly close. It felt like a violation of the most private part of myself, my own subconscious. After that nightmare text, I couldn't bear to have the phone near me anymore. It felt like a tether to something malevolent, a constant reminder that I was being watched, listened to, in the one place I was supposed to be safe. That night, I made a conscious decision. I went downstairs, found an old shoebox, and placed my phone inside. I then sealed the box with an entire roll of duct tape, wrapped it in an old t-shirt, and finally, just to be extra sure, I hid the whole thing in the back of a closet in a guest room, under a pile of forgotten blankets and old photo albums. The house felt lighter, freer, with the device gone. I almost smiled, a sense of relief washing over me. I finally had my space back. I was in control again, or so I thought. That I managed to fall asleep that night, exhausted from the emotional turmoil of the past few days. I didn't have any nightmares, just a deep, dreamless sleep that was a welcome escape from reality. When I woke up, the first thing I did was sprint to the guest room. My heart hammered in my chest as I tore through the layers of blankets and clothes. The shoebox was exactly where I'd left it, untouched, the tape still perfectly sealed. I ripped it open, and there it was, my phone. I hesitantly turned it on, half expecting nothing, but the screen lit up with a familiar notification. A new text message. I felt the color drain from my face. I opened it, my hand trembling so hard I could barely hold the device. The message described my dreamless sleep, saying something about the peace of mind I felt, and ended with, "You don't need a phone for me to see you." I dropped the phone like a hot coal and backed away from it, my body shaking with a profound and primal terror. That last message, the one that said, "You don't need a phone for me to see you," was what broke me. I spent the next 2 weeks in a haze of paranoia, jumping at every shadow, every creak of the house. I had to get help. I called the police, my voice a shaky mess as I tried to explain the situation. The officer who showed up, a young guy with a skeptical expression and a name tag that read Officer Mills, clearly thought I was unhinged. He listened patiently to my story, nodding along. But I could tell by the way he was constantly checking his watch that he just wanted to get it over with. I showed him the phone and the messages. His expression didn't change much, just a slight narrowing of the eyes. He took my phone and a copy of the message logs, promising to look into it, a phrase that sounded more like a polite dismissal than a genuine promise. To my surprise, he actually called me back a few days later. His voice was different, less patronizing, more serious. He asked me to come down to the station. When I got there, he introduced me to a forensics technician, a quiet woman with sharp, intelligent eyes. She explained that they had run the number through every database, every carrier, and it didn't exist. The number wasn't from any known cell service or online messaging app. It was a digital ghost. They even tried to trace the IP address, but it led to a dead end. That's when she said something that made the hair on my arm stand up. "The messages aren't coming from the internet," she said, her voice low. "They're being sent through an internal network, something that's physically close to you." The police, now intrigued and a little spooked themselves, got a warrant to search my house, not for a person, but for a signal source. They came in with these bizarre-looking sensors and detectors and spent hours walking around, pointing the devices at the walls and floors. The technician with the sharp eyes, the one who had explained the signal to me, was the one who found it. She was in my study, a room I spent hours in every day, a room I felt I knew every inch of. She pointed her detector at a specific section of the wall behind a built-in bookshelf, and the device went crazy, beeping rapidly. They cut into the wall, and I watched, my stomach in knots, as they pulled out a contraption I could only describe as something out of a sci-fi movie. It was a metal box, roughly the size of a shoebox, covered in a thick layer of dust. It looked ancient, as if it had been sealed inside the walls for decades. It had no visible buttons, no antenna, just a small, rectangular screen and a few strange ports on the side. It was so old, it looked like it shouldn't even work. The police handled it with extreme caution, like it was a live bomb. They took it back to the station, and I was left alone in my house, now with a gaping hole in my wall and a new kind of silence that felt even more terrifying than the last. They called me the next day. The technician explained that they had to get special equipment just to turn the device on. When they finally managed to do it, the screen flickered to life. It didn't have a menu, no home screen, just a single, pulsing cursor. And then, a message appeared, slowly typing itself out, one letter at a time. The police officer on the phone sounded genuinely shaken as he read it to me, his voice barely above a whisper. "He already knows you found out." I dropped the phone. The device wasn't a prank, wasn't a camera, wasn't a joke. It was something else, something from my own house, something that had been watching me, in silence, for who knows how long. The he in the message, it wasn't the device itself, but the person who put it there. The person who already knows. The police never found out who it was, and I sold the house as soon as I could, never looking back. But even now, years later, I still can't shake the feeling that I'm being watched. Every time my phone lights up with a new text, a new message from an unknown number, I feel that same cold dread, and I wonder if the he has found me again. You know, it's funny how you look back at moments in your life and realize how everything was just leading to one specific point. For me, that point was the summer of 2011. I was just a kid, maybe 12 or 13, and my parents had just bought this big, old Victorian house a few towns over from where we lived. It was one of those houses you see in movies, with a wraparound porch, a creaky front door, and a massive, overgrown yard. My dad, a history professor who loved anything with a story, was ecstatic. My mom, a vibrant interior designer with a knack for making any space feel like home, saw it as a blank canvas. Me? I was just a shy, awkward kid with a pile of video games, a new room to claim as my own, and the constant hum of my dad's old record player filling the quiet house with the classics. My life was pretty simple back then, and I had no idea it was about to get turned completely upside down. It all started with this weird painting that was already there when we moved in. It was in the living room, hanging on a wall next to the fireplace. It was huge, framed in this heavy, dark wood, and it was the first thing you saw when you walked in. The painting itself was strange. It was a portrait of a family, a man, a woman, and a little girl. They all looked so somber, almost sickly. The man had a long, gaunt face and eyes that seemed to follow you. The woman was just as pale, with her hair pulled back so tight it looked painful. The little girl held a porcelain doll that was missing an eye, and she had this unsettling, vacant expression. They were all dressed in these old, stiff-looking clothes from a time I couldn't even place. My dad thought it was a treasure, a part of the house's history. My mom found it creepy, but she kept saying it had character and that she could work with it. I hated it from the start. I remember standing there, staring at it for the first time, and feeling this cold, heavy sensation settle in my stomach. It was like the air around the painting was thicker, colder. A few days later, my mom tried to take it down and repaint the wall, but it was nailed in so tight, it wouldn't budge. We just gave up on it, thinking it was just a strange quirk of an old house. If only we had known. For a while, we honestly forgot about it. We were busy unpacking, painting rooms, and dealing with all the little quirks of an old house. The painting just faded into the background, a permanent, albeit unsettling, part of the living room decor. I'd be playing my PlayStation 2 on the big, ugly couch my parents got from a thrift store, and the portrait would just be there. The somber family, forever frozen in time. Then, one afternoon, I was walking past, and something caught my eye. It was my mom, standing in front of the painting, her head tilted to the side. "Hey, sweetie," she said, without turning. "Does that little girl look like she's holding a doll with a blue ribbon to you?" I squinted. The doll had a brown ribbon. My mom shook her head and went to the kitchen. When I looked again, the ribbon was still brown, but the little girl's dress, it was now the same shade of faded yellow as the dress my mom had worn the day before when she was cleaning. My blood ran cold. It had to be a trick of the light, a weird reflection. I walked closer, my heart thumping. I swear, the man in the painting, the one with the gaunt face, was wearing a pair of dark, wire-frame glasses. The same kind my dad used to wear when he was grading papers late at night. The creepiest part was how they were perched on his nose, just like my dad's did, a little crooked. I didn't say anything, not wanting to sound crazy. I just went to my room and tried to forget about it. That was the beginning of the end of any kind of normal. The changes started getting more frequent and more obvious. The figures in the painting weren't just changing their clothes to match ours. They were adopting our habits, our little details. The woman in the painting, who used to stand so stiffly, was now sitting in a plush armchair that looked just like the one my mom loved to read in. She had a teacup in her hands, and I could have sworn the steam rising from it was a faint, hazy wisp of real mist. The little girl, her porcelain doll with the missing eye still in her arms, was now sitting on the floor with her legs crossed, exactly like I did when I was playing video games. There was this one evening when my dad was on the phone, laughing at some story a friend was telling him, and I looked at the painting. The gaunt man, who had always looked so stern, had a slight, almost imperceptible smirk on his face. It wasn't a happy expression, more like a sneer, a cruel imitation of my dad's joy. The feeling of being watched, of having our lives mirrored by these painted strangers, became a constant, low-level dread in the house. It was like our privacy was gone, replaced by an audience of silent, painted observers who were taking notes on our every move. Things were getting really weird now, and the worst part was that my parents were starting to notice it too. My mom kept moving the furniture around, trying to redecorate the living room to make it feel different, but the painting always found a way to adapt. One day, she swapped out our old, tattered coffee table for a beautiful antique she found. The next morning, The little girl in the painting was sitting on the floor, and in front of her was a miniature version of the exact same table, carved with such intricate detail you could almost feel the grain of the wood. My mom just stared at it, her face a mixture of fear and fascination. My dad, ever the logical one, tried to rationalize it all away. "It's just our minds playing tricks on us," he'd say. "We're looking for things that aren't there." But I saw the way his hand would tremble slightly as he said it, and the way he'd refuse to meet my mom's eyes. The painted family was a constant, silent presence, a fifth member of our family that never spoke but always watched. It felt like they were getting closer, not just in their likeness to us, but in the way they were starting to appear in our daily lives. Then, things escalated from unsettling to truly terrifying. It was a Tuesday evening, I think. My dad was reading a book, my mom was knitting a sweater, and I was on the couch, lost in a new video game. I happened to glance up at the painting, and that's when I saw it. It wasn't one of us this time. In the background, in the shadows behind the painted family, a new figure had appeared. It was a man, his face obscured by the brim of a dark, wide-brimmed hat. He was just there, stiff, unmoving, and utterly menacing. The kind of menacing that doesn't need to do anything to make your skin crawl. He wasn't part of the original family. He was an outsider, just like us. But unlike us, he wasn't mirroring our lives. He was just watching, just standing there, a dark stain on the canvas, a silent witness to our every move. I didn't say anything. I just froze. My hands went numb on the controller, and my breath caught in my throat. I wanted to scream, to point at the wall and demand my parents see what I was seeing, but I couldn't. I was paralyzed by a fear so cold and complete it felt like I was drowning in it. I knew, with a certainty that chilled me to the bone, that the painting was no longer just about us. It was about him, and he was finally here. That night was the worst night of my life. I couldn't sleep. Every shadow in my room seemed to writhe and stretch, and the old house's usual creaks and groans sounded like someone was whispering my name. I kept thinking about the man in the hat, his dark silhouette in the painting, the way he just watched. It felt like his eyes, unseen, were on me right now. I was tossing and turning, pulling my blanket up to my chin like it could offer any protection from this new terror. Finally, I must have drifted off, because the next thing I knew I was bolt upright in bed, a cold sweat drenching my pajamas. I'd had a nightmare, one of those hyper-realistic ones that sticks to you even after you wake up. In it, I was in my room, but the walls were melting, turning into the dark, oily colors of the painting, and the man with the hat was at my window, his face still in shadow, just staring. The memory of his dark form against the glass was so vivid, so real, that I couldn't breathe. I scrambled out of bed, my heart hammering against my ribs, and ran to my parents' room, bursting through the door without knocking. My mom woke with a gasp, my dad fumbling for the lamp on the nightstand. "What is it?" my mom asked, her voice thick with sleep. I couldn't speak. I was just pointing toward the window in a frantic, stuttering gesture. "The man with the hat." I finally choked out, my voice a broken whisper. He was at my window. My parents exchanged a look, a mix of concern and confusion. My dad tried to calm me down, but I was inconsolable. I wasn't scared because of a dream. I was scared because it felt real. It felt like a memory, not a nightmare. My dad, ever the skeptic, got up and checked my window. Nothing. He said it was just a bad dream, but his face was pale in the dim light. My mom, on the other hand, went to the living room. I followed her, my dad close behind. She had a flashlight in her hand, and she aimed the beam directly at the painting. And that's when we saw it. The somber family was gone. In their place was a new scene. My dad, my mom, and me. We were all in our beds, asleep. My dad's book was on his nightstand, my mom's knitting was on the floor, and I was wrapped up in my blankets. It was us. The painting had finally caught up. But the horror was in the details. My heart stopped. It was us, sleeping. But there was something else in the painting. Behind my sleeping figure, a dark form stood at the edge of my bed. Behind my mom, another form. And behind my dad, a third. They were all the same dark, wide-brimmed hat. The man was in all of our rooms. He wasn't just at my window. He was in the house. He was in our bedrooms. The painting wasn't just mirroring our lives anymore. It was showing us what was happening in real time, what we couldn't see. My mom let out a small, terrified whimper, and my dad's face, which had been pale before, was now a ghostly white. The man in the hat was no longer just a figure in a painting. He was a presence, a living, breathing horror that was sharing our home. We stood there, frozen in front of the canvas, the cold from the painting seeming to leach into the room, making my teeth chatter. The only light was the weak beam from my mom's flashlight, trembling in her hand as she pointed it at the horrifying scene. My dad, bless his heart, found his voice first. "We need to get this thing out of the house," he said, his voice low and firm, but with an unmistakable tremor. We tried everything. We tried to pry it off the wall with a crowbar, but it was like the frame was part of the plaster. We tried to cover it with a blanket, but the edges of the canvas seemed to bleed through, and the painting would still be visible, a faint, ghostly image on the surface of the fabric. My mom even tried to paint over it, but the paint simply wouldn't stick. It would drip down the canvas in black, oily rivulets, like tears, and the scene would remain clear as day. We were trapped. We had a constant, silent observer in our house, a witness to our lives, and now, a sinister figure that was seemingly a part of our home. We couldn't sleep, we couldn't eat. The fear was a constant, suffocating weight, and every creak in the house, every shadow, every strange sound, was him. We had no idea what he wanted, what he was, or what would happen to us. We just knew he was there. 2 months. That's how long we lived like that. We were prisoners in our own home, constantly watching the painting, living in a perpetual state of quiet, suffocating fear. The man with the hat never showed his face, but he was always there, a shadowy figure in the corner of the canvas, sometimes a little closer, sometimes a little further away. He wasn't mirroring us anymore. He was showing us what was happening in the parts of the house we couldn't see. We'd see a small, glowing orb of light floating down the hallway, and then look at the painting to see the same thing hovering over my parents' bed, a sign that he was in their room. One day, my mom saw a scene of a small, rusty key on the kitchen counter in the painting. We found it a few hours later, tucked away behind the sugar bowl, and we knew he had put it there. He wasn't just a ghost. He was a landlord. We were his tenants, and he was watching over his property. We were terrified, but we also had to live. My parents went back to work, and I went back to school, but we never stayed out late, never had friends over. Our lives shrank to the size of that living room, a small, terrified huddle in the corner of the house. The solution came from my mom, of all people. One day, she came home from work, her face pale, but with a look of fierce determination. She had been talking to a colleague, a specialist in old homes and historical artifacts. My mom, in a moment of desperate honesty, had told her everything. The colleague, a kind, elderly woman named Mrs. Peterson, didn't laugh or call my mom crazy. She just listened, her eyes wide with a mix of shock and understanding. Mrs. Peterson told my mom about the old custom of warding a home, a sort of spiritual contract with the spirits that inhabited a property. It was a way to acknowledge their presence and to ask for their protection in return for a peaceful coexistence. It sounded insane, like something out of a fairy tale, but we were out of options. We just wanted the horror to end. That night, with the painting glowing with a soft, menacing light, my mom stood in front of it. In her hands, she held a small wooden box containing 3 items: a lock of her hair, a silver coin from the year we moved in, and a small, smooth river stone. She placed the box on the mantelpiece, right below the painting, and with a shaky voice, she spoke to the empty room. She wasn't speaking to the painting or to the man in the hat. She was speaking to the house itself. She said that we knew it was old and that we respected the history and the spirits that resided within its walls. She said that we wanted to live there in peace and that we would offer our own lives, our own stories, to the house in exchange for its protection. It was a formal, chilling ritual. My dad just stood there, his arm around my shoulders, his body tense with apprehension. When she finished, we just waited. Nothing happened. The painting didn't change, the man with the hat didn't move, and the air didn't get colder. We went to bed that night, all of us in our own rooms, for the first time in months. The next morning, I woke up, and the first thing I did was run to the living room. The painting was still there, but it was different. The family was back. The somber, sickly family from before we moved in. The man, the woman, and the little girl with the one-eyed doll. They were the only ones there. The man in the hat was gone. The image was frozen in time, exactly as it was the day we moved in. And that's how it's been ever since. The painting never changed again. It's just a regular, creepy old portrait now. But every so often, when I'm alone in the living room, I swear I can feel a faint chill, and I get the sense that the house is watching me, a silent, knowing presence. I think we made a deal, a quiet, unspoken agreement. We gave the house our story, and it gave us our lives back. And to this day, when I get home, I never fail to give the painting a little nod, a silent acknowledgement of the peace we share. So, this happened a few years ago, back when I was still living in my hometown, a place so small and quiet you could practically hear the grass growing. It was the kind of town where everyone knew your business, and the biggest event of the year was the annual pumpkin festival. I was about 22, just drifting through a dead-end job at the local hardware store and spending most of my evenings with my friends, Mark and Chloe. We were a tight trio, the kind of friends who were more like siblings. Our favorite pastime was driving around in my beat-up '98 Ford Ranger, listening to old rock music and just talking about anything and everything. The town was nestled in a valley, and on a hill overlooking everything was this old, creepy watchtower. It was a leftover from some forgotten forest fire service, a tall, skeletal thing of rusted steel and splintered wood. People said it was cursed, haunted, you name it. We'd always steer clear of it, mostly because it just gave off this seriously unsettling vibe, like something was always watching from up there. But that feeling of being watched wasn't just in my head. For about a month, I started seeing something weird every single night. I'd be driving home late, maybe around midnight, and as I'd pass the hill, I'd glance up at the tower. And there it was, a silhouette. Just a dark figure, standing perfectly still at the very top, where the old lookout post was. It was too far to make out any details, but its posture was always the same, straight-backed, hands clasped behind it, just staring down at the town. It was the kind of thing that gave me goosebumps every time. I'd mentioned it to Mark and Chloe, and they just laughed, said it was probably some kids trying to scare people. But it happened night after night. One night, I even stopped the truck for a second just to get a better look, and as I did, I swear the figure's head tilted as if it was following my movement. It was a tiny gesture, almost imperceptible, but it hit me like a ton of bricks. It wasn't just standing there, it was actively observing, a silent sentinel over my quiet little life. That's when I knew this wasn't just some local legend or a prank. This was something else entirely. This growing unease turned into a genuine obsession. I couldn't stop thinking about who, or what, was up there. It wasn't just a figure anymore. It was a constant, gnawing question in the back of my mind. One day, I brought it up to Mark and Chloe again, but this time, I was serious. "Look," I said, "I'm telling you, it's there every single night. And it's not a kid. I think we need to go check it out." Mark, who was always the most skeptical of us, rolled his eyes at first, but Chloe, with her pale skin and big, curious green eyes, actually seemed intrigued. She was the brave one, the one who would dare us to do things we knew we probably shouldn't. She finally convinced Mark, mostly by calling him a chicken, which was our secret code for let's do something stupid together. We planned to go on a Saturday night, after dark, armed with nothing but my truck spotlight and the flimsy flashlights from the hardware store. Looking back, it was probably the dumbest idea we'd ever had, but at the time, it felt like the only way to get some answers and finally shake this feeling of dread. The night we went, the air was unusually still and heavy, the kind of stillness that feels unnatural. The moon was a thin sliver in the sky, barely casting any light. We parked the truck a good distance from the base of the hill and started walking. The ground was littered with broken branches and dry leaves that crunched under our feet, each step echoing in the oppressive silence. As we got closer, the tower loomed over us, a hulking, black silhouette against the almost dark sky. The rusted metal groaned softly in the wind, a low, metallic moan that sounded like a dying beast. My heart was pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. Chloe was gripping my arm, and even Mark, the brave one, was walking with his shoulders hunched, his flashlight beam trembling slightly. We found the entrance, a gaping maw of rotted wood, and stepped inside. The air was thick with the smell of mold, wet earth, and something else, a dry, papery scent, like old books or photos. That smell, mixed with the damp, earthy cold, hit me right in the gut. It was a smell that belonged to something old, forgotten, and deeply, deeply wrong. The stairs were just as we expected, rusted, winding, and creaking with every step we took. It felt like we were climbing into the belly of a forgotten monster. As we reached the top, the air became even colder, pressing in on us like a physical weight. The room at the top of the tower was small, maybe 10 feet by 10 feet, with 4 huge, gaping windows that looked out over the entire town. It was a perfect vantage point. In the center of the room was a small, crudely built wooden table, and on top of it sat a single, old-fashioned camera, the kind with a huge lens and a black cloth you'd drape over your head. It looked like something out of a vintage movie, so out of place in this modern world, and yet somehow it felt exactly right. The camera was sitting on a rotating mount, a detail that sent shivers down my spine. Someone had engineered this to be a permanent surveillance post. The room was lined with makeshift shelves made of splintered wood and old pipes, and on these shelves were dozens of cardboard boxes, all neatly labeled in a precise, almost elegant handwriting. It was an eerie display of meticulous organization in a place of utter decay. We started looking through the boxes, and what we found made my blood run cold. They weren't filled with dusty old papers or forgotten belongings. They were filled with photographs, thousands of them. Mark grabbed the first box, labeled 1987 to 1991, and pulled out a photo of my parents at a town picnic, laughing. Another showed Chloe's dad fishing by the river. It was a bizarre, unsettling collection of candid shots of townspeople, but the photos themselves were so normal. Weddings, kids' birthday parties, family dinners. They were all taken from far away, from angles that didn't make sense, like someone was hiding in the bushes or 100 feet up in a tree. As we moved to the more recent boxes, the photos grew more and more intimate, more intrusive. One showed Mark's little sister sitting at their kitchen table, doing her homework, the flash catching the surprised look on her face. Another showed Chloe's mom, in her pajamas, getting the mail. The sheer volume and specificity of these photos made my skin crawl. It wasn't just a hobby, it was a full-blown, decades-long obsession. Whoever was up here was a ghost, a presence that had been silently woven into the fabric of our lives for as long as we had been alive. And then I saw it. A box, separate from the others, sitting on a small, wobbly stool near the far wall. This one wasn't labeled with years, but with a single, handwritten name, Lucas. My stomach dropped. That's my name. My hands were shaking so hard I could barely open the lid. Inside, stacked with an unnerving neatness, were photos of me. Not just me from afar, like the others. These were different. There was one of me sitting on my bed, scrolling on my phone, taken through my bedroom window from an angle that shouldn't be possible. Another was of me eating cereal in my kitchen, a flash of light reflecting in the window behind me, as if someone was right outside. There was even a photo of me sleeping, the low light of my nightstand lamp barely illuminating my face. The sheer intimacy of it made my skin crawl. It was like looking at a secret life I didn't even know I was living, a performance I was putting on for an audience of one. The photos were so recent, some of them showing me in the same jacket I was wearing that very day. It was beyond disturbing. It was a total violation, a complete erasure of my privacy. As I stood there, frozen, trying to process the horror of it, Chloe let out a sharp gasp. Mark, who was looking through a different box, just went completely silent, his flashlight beam fixed on something in his hand. "Guys," Chloe whispered, her voice a thin, shaky thread. "Look." She was holding a stack of photos, not from a box, but from a small pile on the table next to the camera. They were different from the others. The paper was still glossy and new, the colors vibrant. These weren't faded and old. They were fresh, developed recently, maybe even hours ago. The photos showed people, normal people, but their faces were blurred, like they were taken quickly or the photographer's hand was shaking. But what really made my blood run cold was the very last photo on the stack. It was a picture of the inside of the watchtower, taken from the corner of the room. The angle was impossible. There was no camera there, nothing but us. And in the photo, there we were, Mark, Chloe, and me, standing right where we were, our faces a mask of fear, our flashlights pointed straight at the lens. The photo wasn't just fresh, it was still wet, the emulsion sticky to the touch. It was a photo of us, taken moments before we found it, a sick, twisted snapshot of our own discovery. It was like we had walked into a trap, into a photograph already taken, and the person who took it wasn't there, but they had been. They were always there. My entire body went cold. The air, which was already frigid, felt like ice shards in my lungs. My mind couldn't even process the photo in my hand. It was a physical impossibility. There was no one else in the room, no place to hide. And yet, there we were, staring back at ourselves from a photo that had just been printed. The sheer, terrifying logic of it hit me like a blow to the head. The figure I had been seeing on the tower every night wasn't just a lurker. They were the ghost in the machine, a meticulous, silent artist of surveillance. They were everywhere and nowhere. Mark, pale and quiet, grabbed my arm and pulled me back, his eyes wide with a terror I recognized instantly. "We need to go? Now," he stammered, his voice barely a whisper. There was no argument, no debate. The silence was louder than any scream could have been, filled with the horrifying realization that we had been watched, not just from the tower, but from inside our own lives, every single day. The watchtower wasn't just a place. It was an extension of a singular, malicious consciousness. We stumbled down the stairs, tripping over each other in our desperate haste to get out. The metallic groans of the tower seemed to mock our fear, the creaking would sounding like a malevolent laugh. We didn't say a word until we were back in my truck, speeding away from the hill as fast as the old ranger would go. Back at my place, we just sat in the living room, the lights on, not speaking. The photo was still in my pocket, a clammy, horrifying proof of what we had seen. The silence was thick and heavy, punctuated only by our ragged breathing. Finally, Chloe broke the stillness. "What was that?" she asked, her voice trembling. Who could have done that?" We had no answers. We just sat there, a trio of kids whose lives had been irrevocably changed by the chilling discovery of a secret world they never knew existed. The innocence of our small town was shattered. We weren't the main characters of our own lives anymore. We were subjects in someone else's sick, private documentary. The tower wasn't just a ruin on a hill. It was a monument to a terrifying voyeurism that was so deeply ingrained in our lives we couldn't even see it. The next morning, the terror still clung to us like a second skin. We met up, all of us looking like we hadn't slept a wink. We knew we couldn't just leave it. The thought of that person, whoever they were, still up there, watching us, was unbearable. We had to do something, so we went to the police. I remember sitting in the small, dusty office of Sheriff Miller, a man with a graying mustache who looked like he'd rather be fishing. We told him the whole story, our words stumbling over each other in our panic. He listened patiently, his face a mask of polite skepticism, a smile playing on his lips like he was humoring a bunch of teenagers with a ghost story. We showed him the photo, the horrifying proof. He held it, turning it over in his hand, his brow furrowing as he noticed the wetness of the paper. He didn't say much, just that he'd send a patrol car to check it out. But we could see it in his eyes. He didn't believe us. He thought we were just kids who had broken into a forbidden place and were now looking for attention. Hours later, Sheriff Miller called me. His voice was different this time, devoid of any humor. He sounded unnerved. He said the patrol car found nothing. "The tower's been torn down," he said, his voice a low rumble. "Looks like someone did it with a professional crew. No one saw or heard a thing." My blood ran cold again. The tower, the one that had stood for decades, was gone, just like that. He said they found no cameras, no photos, no tables, nothing. The entire top floor, where we had been just the night before, was a clean slate. It was like it had never existed. He even sent me a photo from his cruiser's dashcam. It was a shot of the hill, now just a mound of dirt and a few splintered beams of wood. The tower was completely gone. We never found out who was in the tower, or how they were able to take it down so quickly without anyone noticing. The figure on the hill was never seen again. The fear, though, never truly left. We still get together, but we never talk about that night. We don't need to. We just look at each other and we know. We were just a fleeting moment in someone's long, silent narrative, a part of a story that ended the moment we found out we were in it. And every now and then, I still catch myself glancing at my bedroom window, just to make sure no one's there.